The morning began like any other in the quiet suburban neighborhood. Sunlight spilled gently across manicured lawns, and the familiar sounds of birdsong mingled with the hum of distant traffic. The protagonist, a diligent homeowner who had lived on this street for several years, enjoyed these peaceful mornings. It was a time for coffee, reflection, and the occasional stroll through the garden. Today, however, something felt slightly off. As the protagonist stepped onto the porch, they noticed movement at the entrance to the neighborhood. A small group of individuals dressed in uniforms and wearing badges were speaking with a delivery driver. The protagonist squinted, trying to make sense of the scene. The uniforms looked official at first glance, but something about the way they moved and interacted seemed unusual. The badges were shiny and neatly clipped, yet they did not match any of the HOA-issued identification that the protagonist had seen before. Curiosity nudged the protagonist forward. They grabbed their phone and took a few discreet photos from a distance. The delivery driver appeared uneasy, glancing at the newcomers before carefully maneuvering the truck past them. The protagonist's mind began to churn with questions. Who were these people? Were they part of the HOA or some other official team? Something about the situation didn't feel right. The answer, it seemed, arrived in the form of a letter left at the protagonist's doorstep. It was typed formally, with a letterhead that mimicked the neighborhood's HOA style. The letter claimed that the homeowner had violated a rule regarding property maintenance and access permissions. The tone was polite but insistent, requesting immediate compliance. The protagonist reread the note several times, certainty and confusion battling within them. Every corner of their property had been meticulously maintained. Nothing had changed since the last routine check. Feeling a mixture of disbelief and concern, the protagonist decided to verify the letter with the official HOA office. A brief call confirmed their growing suspicion. The people at the HOA were unaware of any inspection, complaint, or notice regarding the protagonist's property. There had been no authorized visits, no new rules, and no pending issues. The uniformed individuals at the entrance were not acting on any official instruction. The realization hit hard. These were presenting themselves as HOA officers without any legitimate authority. Despite the initial shock, the protagonist remained calm. They understood that confronting these individuals directly might escalate tensions, and documenting evidence was crucial. Over the next hour, the protagonist observed them more closely. They approached several neighbors, attempting to collect information and restrict access to visitors. The protagonist noticed subtle inconsistencies. The badges were slightly different. The names on the tags did not match any official roster, and the tone of communication was insistent but vague. Neighbors, too, began to notice. Some approached the protagonist cautiously, sharing their own experiences with the unfamiliar figures. A sense of unease spread quietly but steadily through the street. While they did not yet display overt aggression, their presence alone created a shadow of uncertainty. The protagonist realized that action was needed, both for personal safety and to prevent potential complications for others in the neighborhood. As the morning wore on, they began attempting to block certain deliveries and visitors. The protagonist filmed each interaction, ensuring there was a record of the activities. While the situation was unsettling, there was also a strange tension that invigorated the mind. The calm of the morning had been replaced with a quiet alertness, a readiness to respond if circumstances worsened. By late morning, the protagonist felt a mix of determination and vigilance. They knew that understanding the motives and maintaining clear communication with legitimate authorities would be key in navigating the unfolding situation. What had started as a peaceful day had subtly transformed into a delicate standoff. Every movement, every decision carried weight, and the protagonist felt the responsibility to protect not only their own property, but also the calm of the community around them. Little did they know, this unusual morning was only the beginning. The events set in motion would soon escalate in ways that no one could have anticipated, pushing the limits of patience, courage, and quick thinking. What seemed like a strange morning was about to become a test of resolve, and the protagonist would need every ounce of composure they had to face what lay ahead. By mid-morning, the neighborhood's quiet rhythm had been noticeably disrupted. The protagonist watched from their porch as they continued to move along the street, interacting with residents and visitors alike. Their presence was subtle yet unnerving, like shadows gliding across a familiar landscape. Each time a delivery driver approached, they stepped forward, asking questions and inspecting vehicles. Some drivers hesitated before moving on, unsure whether they were following proper directions or risking confrontation. The protagonist decided it was time to be proactive. They walked through their front yard, phone in hand, recording interactions from a safe distance. Every word, every gesture, every badge detail was captured. They seemed confident, speaking with authority even when their instructions did not make sense. They claimed to enforce rules that had not been communicated through official channels. Neighbors who approached to ask questions were met with polite but firm answers, leaving a lingering sense of confusion. Word began to spread quietly from house to house. Some neighbors peeked through blinds or stepped onto their driveways to see what was happening. There was curiosity, yes, but also concern. Children played nearby, unaware of the tension that had settled over the street. Pet owners called their dogs indoors and cars passed slowly, drivers observing the unusual scene. The protagonist, while uneasy, felt a growing responsibility not only to their own home, but to those around them. As they moved toward the center of the street, the protagonist noticed that their approach to restricting access was becoming more organized. They were attempting to direct traffic, deciding who could enter and who could not. Though there was no authority backing them, their uniformed appearance gave them a convincing presence. The protagonist felt a chill at the thought that anyone unfamiliar with the neighborhood might follow their instructions without question. Neighbors began to gather in small clusters, sharing observations. Some expressed worry about the strange behavior, while others simply wanted to understand who these people were. The protagonist approached a few neighbors, calmly explaining that the individuals were not officially authorized and that it was best to remain observant while continuing normal routines. There was a collective sense of solidarity forming, a quiet reassurance that people were not alone in noticing something unusual. The next move added a layer of urgency. They began questioning visitors with an air of insistence, attempting to block access to certain homes. Packages were delayed, and friends coming to visit felt hesitation. Though there was no aggressive behavior, the interruptions were enough to spark concern. The protagonist's documentation became more important than ever. Every video clip, every photo, and every note could serve as evidence to clarify the situation later. Despite the rising tension, the protagonist maintained a sense of calm focus. They understood that patience, observation, and clear communication with legitimate authorities were essential. Calls to the official HOA office confirmed once more that they had no connection to the organization. This reassurance helped to anchor the protagonist, allowing them to remain composed while planning next steps. By afternoon, the influence over the street was more apparent. Their attempts to control access and monitor residents created an atmosphere that was quietly unsettling. Mail carriers lingered longer than usual, delivery drivers called ahead for instructions, and neighbors whispered questions from their porches. The protagonist realized that the situation was moving beyond mere curiosity. It required careful attention and timely action. Through it all, the protagonist noticed something else. They were not malicious in an overt sense, yet their actions were causing confusion, delays, and unease. This subtlety made the situation more complex, as there was no clear confrontation to point to, only a growing awareness that things were not as they should be. Every step had to be measured, every word recorded, and every interaction noted. As the day progressed, the protagonist felt a mixture of anxiety and determination. They understood that resolving the situation required both strategy and courage. Little did they know, the events of the afternoon would escalate far beyond questions of access or authority. A sudden emergency was approaching, one that would test the protagonist's presence of mind, the vigilance of the neighbors, and the limits of patience and composure. What had begun as a quiet morning of observation and curiosity was about to shift into a situation where every second counted, where decisions mattered more than ever, and where the protagonist would face challenges that no one in the neighborhood had anticipated. By late afternoon, the neighborhood had settled into a tense rhythm. They continued their rounds, moving from driveway to driveway with the same calm, authoritative demeanor that unsettled so many. The protagonist remained vigilant, watching, recording, and occasionally speaking with neighbors who sought guidance. There was an underlying sense of unease, but life went on. Children played under watchful eyes, mail was delivered with slight delays, and visitors approached with cautious curiosity. Then a sudden sound broke through the relative quiet, a panicked shout followed by a loud thump from one of the homes nearby. The protagonist rushed toward the commotion, heart racing, and saw a neighbor leaning heavily against their front door, clearly struggling. Something was very wrong. Immediate action was required. The homeowner's spouse quickly dialed emergency services, describing a serious medical situation that needed rapid attention. Within minutes, sirens echoed through the streets as paramedics arrived. The scene became a hub of urgency and focus. The protagonist helped guide first responders to the affected property while ensuring neighbors stayed at a safe distance. The, however, arrived at the same moment, stepping into the path of the emergency team. They claimed that the area was restricted under HOA rules, their voices calm but insistent. They gestured toward the lawn and driveway as if issuing instructions, unaware, or perhaps indifferent, to the urgency of the situation. The protagonist stepped forward, firmly but politely insisting that the medical emergency took priority. They explained that every second counted and that the interference could slow down critical care. Despite the clarity of the situation, they hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the intensity of the emergency. Their expressions flickered between confusion and defiance. The protagonist remained calm, speaking slowly and assertively, ensuring the paramedics could work without obstruction. Realizing the severity of the patient's condition, the emergency team decided that air transport was necessary. A helicopter rescue was requested, and within minutes, the distinctive sound of rotors approached the neighborhood. The now clearly anxious moved to block the landing area, citing rules and claiming authority. The protagonist felt a surge of frustration tempered by urgency. There was no time for argument or confusion. The air ambulance needed a clear landing zone immediately. Neighbors began gathering around, some recording the scene on their phones. They whispered to one another, sharing concern and disbelief. The protagonist took a deep breath, focusing entirely on maintaining space for the helicopter while ensuring they did not escalate further. They reminded the crowd that safety and order were paramount, calmly guiding onlookers back from the landing area. As the helicopter hovered above, they hesitated. The protagonist spoke firmly, emphasizing the medical emergency and the need for immediate cooperation. Their voice carried authority born of clarity and urgency, not intimidation. Slowly, they stepped aside, though their expressions revealed confusion and uncertainty. The protagonist felt a mix of relief and adrenaline, knowing that the landing could proceed without delay. The helicopter descended, its blades whipping the air around the lawn and driveway. The patient was swiftly secured and prepared for transport, the medical team working efficiently and without distraction. The protagonist stayed close, assisting with guidance and ensuring the area remained clear. Neighbors watched with awe, recognizing the stakes and the professionalism of the emergency personnel. Once the patient was loaded safely into the helicopter, they retreated slightly, uncertain of their role in the unfolding events. The protagonist's careful balance of firmness and calm had prevented a potential delay in care. As the helicopter lifted into the sky, carrying the patient to the medical facility, a wave of relief washed over the street. The authority had been neutralized, and the neighborhood breathed collectively, grateful for the swift response. Despite the relief, the protagonist knew the day was far from over. They remained on the property, their motives still unclear, and the aftermath of the emergency would require careful attention. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some expressing gratitude, others lingering with curiosity. The protagonist realized that vigilance, documentation, and clear communication with legitimate authorities would continue to be crucial in restoring peace and order. What had started as a calm morning had transformed into a high-stakes situation, testing the protagonist's courage, quick thinking, and ability to maintain calm under pressure. The helicopter rescue had been successful, but the present suggested that challenges were far from resolved. The day's events were only the beginning of a larger story, one that would require courage, strategy, and the unwavering attention of the community. The helicopter lifted smoothly into the sky, carrying the patient safely to the hospital, but the tension on the ground lingered. The remained, their uniforms still crisp and badges gleaming, their presence a quiet but persistent disruption to the neighborhood's calm. The protagonist knew that while the immediate emergency had been addressed, the situation required careful attention. It was not enough to let things settle on their own. They had to be confronted calmly and decisively. The protagonist stepped forward, moving toward with measured steps. Their phone was still recording, capturing every detail of the standoff. They looked up, their faces a mixture of surprise and controlled confidence. They attempted to assert themselves once more, gesturing toward the area where the helicopter had just landed. Their tone was polite yet firm, as if they were enforcing rules that only they understood. "Please step aside," the protagonist said calmly, voice steady but carrying authority. "The emergency has passed and the area needs to be cleared. This is private property, and your presence here is causing confusion and concern." They hesitated. They exchanged quick glances, whispering to each other in muted tones. Their posture remained upright, but the sharpness in their eyes faltered slightly. The protagonist continued, speaking clearly and slowly. "We have with the official HOA that no instructions authorize your actions. It is important that you respect the guidance of legitimate authorities and the residents here." A few neighbors had gathered, keeping a respectful distance while watching the unfolding scene. Some whispered encouragement, others quietly recorded their own footage. The protagonist's calm demeanor seemed to ripple outward, easing the anxiety that had begun to spread after the emergency. They were clearly uncertain about how to respond. Despite the protagonist's insistence, they initially refused to move completely. Their voices remained polite but filled with vague references to rules and authority. The standoff stretched, and the protagonist realized that intervention from outside the immediate circle would be necessary to fully resolve the situation. They stepped back momentarily to speak to a neighbor, explaining the importance of contacting law enforcement to prevent any escalation. Within minutes, the sound of approaching vehicles signaled the arrival of local authorities. Patrol cars pulled onto the street, lights flashing softly but clearly visible. They turned, their confidence slightly waning as officers approached to take control of the situation. The protagonist stood nearby, quietly providing a summary of events and presenting the recordings that documented the actions throughout the day. The officers spoke calmly to them, explaining that their presence was unauthorized and that they would need to leave the property. They maintained a polite demeanor, but it was clear that their plan had been disrupted. The protagonist observed closely, ensuring that the neighbors remained at a safe distance and that the atmosphere stayed calm. There was no yelling, no confrontation, just the measured handling of a delicate scenario. Even as law enforcement spoke, they tried to reiterate their supposed authority, pointing to papers and badges that appeared official but had been confirmed as invalid. The protagonist watched carefully, feeling a quiet sense of relief that the authorities were taking control. The neighbors murmured in reassurance, recognizing that the situation was finally under professional supervision. As the officers guided them off the property, the protagonist reflected on the day's events. The calm, focused response to confusion and uncertainty had prevented a situation from escalating further. Every step, from documentation to measured communication to involving authorities, had contributed to maintaining safety and clarity. The influence was being neutralized without any need for conflict. Once they were escorted away, the street slowly began to regain its familiar rhythm. Children resumed their play under watchful eyes, neighbors returned to their routines, and the protagonist took a moment to breathe deeply on the front porch. While the events had been stressful, the protagonist felt a growing sense of accomplishment. Calm and decisive action had prevented disruption and ensured the neighborhood's safety. However, the protagonist also understood that this was not the end of the story. Questions lingered. Why had they appeared? What were their true intentions? And how could such a situation be prevented in the future? These thoughts would guide the next steps, both in collaboration with authorities and within the community itself. The day had already demonstrated the value of vigilance, clarity, and calm determination. The protagonist knew that lessons had been learned and that the neighborhood's sense of security would be strengthened. And though the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawns, A quiet sense of hope and preparedness settled over the street. By early evening, the atmosphere on the street was tense but controlled. They had been confronted and politely asked to step aside, yet a lingering uncertainty remained. Their reluctance to leave completely had prompted law enforcement to request additional support, ensuring that the situation could be resolved safely and efficiently. Within minutes, the quiet hum of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of a specialized team. SWAT units rolled into the neighborhood with precision and calm authority. Their presence was unmistakable. Uniformed officers moved in coordinated formation, carrying equipment designed for security and protection, but not for confrontation. The protagonist watched from the safety of their porch, phone in hand, ready to document any further developments. Neighbors had gathered nearby, maintaining a respectful distance, their curiosity tempered by a sense of relief that trained professionals were handling the situation. The still standing near the driveway where the helicopter had landed earlier looked up in surprise. The confident composure they had maintained throughout the day wavered slightly. The SWAT team approached slowly, their body language calm yet commanding. Officers spoke clearly and politely, explaining that the individuals on the property had no authority and needed to comply with instructions. The protagonist could see the exchanging nervous glances, uncertainty replacing their previous air of control. "Please follow our directions," an officer said, voice firm but courteous. "We are here to ensure everyone's safety. This will be handled quickly and efficiently if you cooperate." For a moment they hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. The protagonist noticed that their previous confidence was now replaced with visible doubt. Neighbors watched in silence, the tension in the air thick but contained. The SWAT officers moved in measured steps, guiding toward the squad vehicles. There was no yelling, no escalation, just careful, professional coordination. The protagonist stepped forward to provide a brief explanation to the officers. They recounted the morning's events, the letter claiming a rule infraction, the interference with visitors and deliveries, and the helicopter rescue earlier in the day. The officers listened attentively, taking notes and reviewing the recordings the protagonist had made. Every detail mattered in ensuring the situation was documented and resolved appropriately. As they were escorted from the property, their polite refusals and repeated claims of authority became softer, their attempts to argue fading under the weight of clear and professional intervention. The SWAT team handled the process with precision, ensuring that the neighborhood remained safe and calm throughout. It was clear that the situation, though unusual and unsettling, was now under complete control. Neighbors began to relax, some clapping softly in quiet approval, others whispering gratitude toward the protagonist for their composure and documentation. Children cautiously resumed play in the yards, their laughter returning to the street after hours of unusual tension. The protagonist allowed themselves a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day's events shift slightly toward relief. Once they were secured in the squad vehicles, officers spoke briefly with the protagonist and nearby neighbors, emphasizing that the situation had been handled professionally and that everyone could return to their routines safely. The protagonist shared the recordings and documentation with law enforcement, ensuring a complete record of the events for follow-up purposes. The officers thanked the protagonist, noting that their calm and organized response had been critical in managing the day's challenges. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the street, the neighborhood slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm. The protagonist walked along the sidewalk, greeting neighbors and checking in to ensure everyone felt safe. Conversations were quiet but filled with relief, as residents reflected on the unusual day and the swift, effective response by authorities. Even as calm returned, the protagonist knew that vigilance remained important. The motives had yet to be fully understood, and the day's events offered important lessons about awareness, preparation, and the value of remaining composed under pressure. The protagonist felt a quiet sense of pride, not in confrontation, but in the ability to act responsibly and calmly when it mattered most. By nightfall, the street was quiet again, illuminated by porch lights and soft reflections on the lawns. The helicopter's earlier flight and the SWAT team's intervention had ensured safety and stability. The protagonist watched from the porch, reflecting on how swiftly events had escalated and how crucial it had been to maintain calm, gather evidence, and involve the proper authorities. The neighborhood had endured an unusual challenge, and through careful, measured actions, it had come through safely. The neighborhood slowly settled into a sense of calm after the events of the day. They had been escorted away, the helicopter had taken the patient to safety, and law enforcement was finishing up their follow-up procedures. The protagonist stepped onto the porch, letting the cool evening air brush against their face, a mixture of relief and lingering tension settling in. The quiet hum of the neighborhood returned, interrupted only by the occasional conversation between neighbors or the distant bark of a dog. Even as life returned to its normal rhythm, the events of the day weighed heavily on everyone. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, speaking in hushed tones about what had transpired. Some shared observations they had made, others expressed gratitude to the protagonist for maintaining calm and clarity throughout the standoff. It became clear that the day had left a lasting impression on the community, reminding them of both the unexpected challenges that could arise and the importance of unity and awareness. The protagonist moved through the street, checking on neighbors and ensuring that everyone felt safe. They listened as people recounted the moments when they had approached, trying to restrict access or enforce rules that did not exist. Each story reinforced the importance of vigilance and preparedness. The protagonist offered reassurance, emphasizing that the situation had been handled without anyone being harmed and that the neighborhood had acted responsibly. Law enforcement remained for a short while longer, completing reports and collecting documentation. The protagonist provided the recordings, photographs, and notes they had diligently compiled throughout the day. Officers commended the protagonist for their composure, noting that the careful gathering of evidence had been essential in managing the situation effectively. "Your calm and organized approach made a big difference," one officer said. "It allowed us to act quickly and safely." As the evening progressed, the protagonist reflected on the events from a quiet corner of their yard. The day had been a test of patience, observation, and quick thinking. The helicopter rescue had highlighted the urgency of action in emergencies, while the presence of the had underscored the value of documentation, clarity, and proper communication. The protagonist realized that each decision made throughout the day, from remaining calm during confrontations to guiding neighbors and contacting authorities, had contributed to a successful outcome. Neighbors began to gather in small groups, speaking with each other and sharing a sense of solidarity. There was no fear, only a renewed understanding of the importance of vigilance and cooperation. Conversations shifted toward practical steps the community could take to prevent similar situations in the future, verifying identification, maintaining clear communication channels with official HOA representatives, and encouraging residents to report unusual activity promptly. The protagonist joined a small circle of neighbors on the sidewalk, sharing thoughts and listening to others. It was a quiet moment, but one filled with connection and shared understanding. The day had been challenging, but it had also strengthened the bonds within the neighborhood. People expressed gratitude, not just for the protagonist's actions, but for the way the community had come together to support one another. As night fell, porch lights illuminated the lawns, casting warm reflections across the street. They were no longer a threat, and the helicopter rescue had ensured the patient's safety. Yet the protagonist knew that awareness and preparedness were ongoing responsibilities. The events had served as a reminder that calm, clear thinking, and collaboration with authorities were essential in maintaining safety and order. The protagonist returned inside their home, taking a moment to sit quietly and reflect on the day. The adrenaline that had carried them through the standoff and the emergency rescue slowly began to fade, replaced by a steady sense of accomplishment. They had faced an unusual and challenging situation with composure, ensuring the well-being of both the patient and the neighborhood. In the days that followed, the community continued to share stories of the day's events, but with a sense of pride and resilience. The protagonist's careful actions had become a model for neighbors, illustrating the importance of calm leadership and clear thinking. The neighborhood had faced uncertainty and emerged stronger, more aware, and more connected. As the evening deepened into night, the protagonist stood once more on the porch, looking out across the familiar street. The quiet of the neighborhood, now restored, was a reminder that even after unexpected challenges, calm, clarity, and collaboration could restore balance. The day had been a test, and it had been passed, leaving the protagonist with a sense of peace, accomplishment, and hope for the days to come. The days following the incident brought a renewed sense of focus and unity to the neighborhood. The had been removed, the authorities had completed their initial investigations, and the helicopter rescue had ensured that the medical emergency had been addressed without delay. Yet, the events had left a lasting impression on the residents, highlighting the importance of vigilance, communication, and preparation. The protagonist took an active role in helping neighbors understand what had happened and what steps could be taken to prevent similar situations in the future. Meetings were organized in small groups, first informally on porches and in driveways, then officially with the guidance of the legitimate HOA. Residents shared their experiences, asked questions, and listened attentively as the protagonist outlined the timeline of the day's events. The clear documentation, photographs, videos, and notes provided a foundation for constructive discussion and practical planning. The real HOA representatives attended one of the first formal gatherings. They explained the measures being taken to strengthen neighborhood security and ensure that residents could confidently distinguish authorized personnel from. Clear identification procedures, updated contact lists, and direct communication channels were introduced. The protagonist observed the discussions closely, offering input based on their first-hand experience while encouraging neighbors to ask questions and provide feedback. Legal steps also became a topic of conversation. They were facing follow-up actions for their unauthorized presence, and the HOA worked closely with law enforcement to clarify rules and responsibilities. While the situation had been unsettling, it also offered an opportunity for the neighborhood to strengthen its processes and protocols. The protagonist's recordings and careful observations had proven invaluable, providing evidence that ensured proper accountability without conflict. Neighbors began taking small but meaningful steps to enhance safety. Watch groups were formed, not as a means of suspicion, but as a proactive network for awareness and support. Communication apps and community boards were updated, allowing residents to share information quickly and efficiently. The protagonist felt a sense of pride as neighbors approached them with gratitude and questions, recognizing that a shared commitment to vigilance and clarity was empowering the community rather than creating fear. The incident also highlighted the importance of calm and measured responses. Residents reflected on how the protagonist had handled the situation, remaining composed, documenting carefully, and engaging authorities appropriately. These actions had ensured that safety was maintained, emergency care was not delayed, and they were removed professionally. Conversations during neighborhood meetings emphasized that clear thinking and patience were as critical as any procedural safeguard. As the days turned into weeks, the neighborhood regained a sense of normalcy. Children played outdoors with renewed energy, deliveries returned to their usual schedule, and visitors moved freely through the streets. Yet there was also a subtle layer of awareness, a quiet readiness to respond to unusual situations, grounded in the confidence that the neighborhood had the tools and knowledge to act responsibly. The protagonist continued to participate actively in community discussions, offering guidance and support whenever necessary. They encouraged neighbors to document concerns, to communicate directly with HOA representatives, and to prioritize cooperation with authorities whenever unusual events occurred. Their calm and thoughtful approach became a model for handling unexpected challenges, reinforcing the idea that preparation, communication, and composure could prevent minor disruptions from becoming crises. Through these efforts, relationships within the neighborhood strengthened. Residents who had been casual acquaintances became allies in observation and mutual support. The shared experience of facing and ensuring a safe resolution created a sense of solidarity that lingered long after the helicopters and sirens had disappeared from memory. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had transitioned from uncertainty to confidence. Meetings, discussions, and follow-up actions had reinforced safety measures, clarified procedures, and built trust among neighbors. The protagonist took a quiet moment on their porch, observing the street as the sun set in warm golden light. The calm of the evening reflected the resilience of the community, and the knowledge that careful planning, vigilance, and mutual support could overcome unexpected challenges. The events of that day remained a story to be remembered, not with fear but with pride. The neighborhood had faced an unusual challenge together, and through cooperation, clarity, and careful action, it had emerged stronger, safer, and more connected. The protagonist felt a profound sense of accomplishment, knowing that their efforts had helped guide the community through uncertainty and toward renewed security. With the removed and law enforcement having completed their investigations, the neighborhood slowly settled back into its familiar rhythm. The days that followed were marked by quiet routines, children laughing in their yards, and neighbors greeting each other with a renewed sense of connection. The helicopter rescue and the careful intervention of the authorities had left a lasting impression, reminding everyone that preparedness, vigilance, and calm action were essential in maintaining safety and peace. The protagonist remained attentive, guiding neighbors in implementing the new safety measures introduced by the HOA. Clear identification procedures were in place, communication channels were streamlined, and residents were encouraged to share concerns promptly. These measures were designed not to create anxiety, but to foster confidence and collaboration. The protagonist emphasized that a well-informed community was a resilient community, capable of addressing challenges together without fear or confusion. Community meetings became a regular part of neighborhood life. Residents gathered to discuss updates, share observations, and celebrate the small victories that had come from the collective response to the unusual events. The protagonist often facilitated these discussions, providing insight into how calm and structured action had made the day's emergency manageable. Their documentation and detailed notes were shared as examples of best practices for awareness and preparedness. Even casual interactions on the street reflected the stronger sense of connection among neighbors. People paused to talk, checking in on each other's well-being and sharing experiences. The shared challenge of the interference had created a subtle bond, reminding residents that safety was a collective effort. Children played under watchful eyes, neighbors exchanged friendly gestures, and deliveries and visitors moved freely, all without the tension that had briefly overshadowed the community. The protagonist also took time for personal reflection. Standing on their porch in the early evening, they watched as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. The events of the past days had been intense and stressful, yet they had also revealed the strength that could emerge from clear thinking, calm decision-making, and collaboration. The protagonist felt a quiet sense of pride, not for confrontation, but for the ability to act responsibly and maintain order during a challenging situation. Residents began implementing small practical steps to reinforce safety. Doorbell cameras and communication apps were updated, check-ins between neighbors became more regular, and informal watch groups were formed, not out of fear, but to ensure that everyone felt supported. These changes reflected a community that had learned from experience, adapting to prevent confusion and enhance preparedness. The protagonist encouraged participation without alarm, focusing on the positive impact of informed awareness. As the days progressed, the neighborhood regained its full sense of normalcy. Mail and deliveries returned to schedule, visits from friends and family were no longer met with hesitation, and children's laughter once again filled the streets. Yet beneath the familiar routines, there was a quiet layer of vigilance, a readiness rooted in knowledge and collaboration. The events of the past week had strengthened both the community's bonds and its capacity to respond to unexpected situations effectively. One evening, the protagonist walked along the sidewalks, greeting neighbors and exchanging smiles. Conversations were filled with gratitude and reflection, and there was a shared recognition that the neighborhood had grown stronger through cooperation and calm action. The presence had been a moment of challenge, but it had also been an opportunity for growth, awareness, and unity. The protagonist paused at the end of the street, looking up at the sky as the final light of sunset faded. The neighborhood was calm, safe, and vibrant, a testament to the resilience of the community and the power of preparedness. They reflected on the lessons learned, the importance of remaining calm, the value of clear communication, and the strength that emerges when a community acts together. As night fell, the houses glowed softly from porch lights and windows, signaling the return of peace. The protagonist felt a deep sense of accomplishment and hope. The day's challenges had been met with courage, careful thinking, and unity, and the neighborhood had emerged stronger, safer, and more connected. In that quiet moment, the protagonist understood that vigilance was not about fear. It was about awareness, readiness, and the knowledge that a community could face unexpected challenges and thrive. They were gone, the emergency had been resolved, and life had returned to normal. Yet the lessons of the day remained, a quiet reminder that preparation, calm action, and a connected community were the true foundations of security and peace. With a final glance across the street, the protagonist returned inside, carrying with them the quiet confidence that the neighborhood was ready for whatever the future might bring, united, alert, and stronger than ever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.